No, no buzz. Just Bees Book Club. I found this very handsome little copy of Kelly Link's 2001 short story collection, Stranger Things Happen. It's very pretty. It's very pretty. It's actually like a limited edition. Came out in 2012, I want to say. Do, do, do. Yeah, from Subterranean Press, 2012. Um, and when I saw it, I was like, I've been meaning to read any Kelly Link book, but especially Stranger Things Happen for a number of years, and what an opportunity to do it in a little handsome volume. And so I did, and it turns out Kelly Link is a fantastic writer, and she also writes, revamped fairy tales, which is like not my favorite genre in the world, but she does other things as well. And I don't really have a ton to say about the collection. Partially because I read an earlier collection earlier than this one that I'll be talking about later on this program, and I'm going to talk about that at length. And one of the things that that one does is have mildly interesting premises and then kind of flub the writing. Whereas this has mild, interesting premises and sticks the landing on the writing. So it's just like, yeah, it's good. It's a good book. I'll say I think sort of my biggest takeaway. The second to last story in this is called Louise's Ghost, and I think that's like the best story in this for my money. About two women, both named Louise, who are dear friends. One of them has a ghost show up. One of them is tone deaf and sort of manages a concert hall and really likes to sleep with cellists. And it turns out cellists really like ghosts, and so a bunch of stuff happens. And just like a really well told story. The thing that I realized after I saw this volume and took it home and decided to read it is that the cover art is actually by Kathleen Jennings, who is a person who I think now has two collections or novellas out. But yeah, I saw it in here. The copyright info, Dust Jacket and Interior Illustrations, copyright 2012 by Kathleen Jennings. I got to talk to Kathleen Jennings over on the Spectology podcast a number of years ago. Three probably actually is the number. Maybe somewhere in that range at least. And we talked about fairy tales and Australian Gothic, and it was very fun. And you can play that clip.
Was the fairy tale aspect like an intentional like structural thing, or like were you drawing specifically from fairy tales?
Being quite familiar with them from the point of view of loving them, less so from an academic perspective, I find them incredibly useful structurally and as a shorthand and as a way of just seeing things, doing things when I'm like doing little observation exercises or teaching a creativity course at the university. There's an exercise I like to do with people where you go out and you sit down and you're like, okay, think of Little Red Riding Hood and now find all the elements of that story in this room or in this patch of the Great Court, and sort of as a template for observing the world, not from any great iconographic ancient archetypal thing or anything like that. I strongly feel that Little Red Riding Hood was probably first told in order to frighten people into going to bed on time.
Yeah.
But I find them very useful as a shorthand. And when people get into discussions of different narrative structures and so forth, for me, I find the easiest shorthand if I'm playing with the narrative structure is just to refer to a particular fairy tale because I'm familiar with it and I can sort of feel the rhythms of that in a less academic way than if I sit down and look at a particular structure from a particular era of history or culture. So I tend to use them when I'm writing. Occasionally I'll be mixing ideas together and go, what if Jane Eyre, but Little Red Riding Hood, but it's Rochester who's Little Red Riding Hood and Jane's the wolf, and then use that as a lens to read Jane Eyre, which is a lot of fun. Rochester
Yeah.
even wears a red cloak at one point, and Jane is very much the unearthly creature waiting beside the road as he rides home, having strayed from the path of life. So you can play with that, and then you can use that to come up with a story.
The thing I first thought of when you were like talking about the structural qualities is there's a bit that definitely takes structural influence from the Pied Piper story, and has a very interesting moment within that where a character within that story refers to it as though it was Sleeping Beauty, and so they have a productive misinterpretation of which fairy tale they're like living through a version of. And yeah, I think there is, so like all of the things you're saying about using these fairy tales as structure like come through in really interesting ways.
Thank you, and I'm really glad it read that way. I enjoy those. I love that productive misinterpretation, which is actually one of my favorite ways of coming up with stories. I'm like, what if Robert Burns' poem To a Mouse is actually being told by, a revolutionary mouse or a very long-lived serial killer or something like this. So I love that as a technique. But also with those stories, this wasn't something I was thinking about when I was working on Fly Away, but a few people have referred to it as folk horror. And again, it's interesting seeing what those people read and don't, because the more I think about it, the more I find that divide between mythic fairy tale fiction and folk horror for me is whether or not either the characters or the reader know the rules of the world. And if the characters or the reader know the rules of the fairy tale that they're in, or of the sort of myth that they're in, then it's probably mythic fiction, or fairy tale fiction, even if it gets very dark. But if they don't know the rules, either the characters or the author, then it's probably folk horror.
Huh.
And the same things can happen.
Yeah.
Nice. It's gonna be very funny if I don't decide not to actually put a clip in there. But maybe I will. Maybe I will with my newfound powers of very, very basic editing that I just feel like doing these days. Anyway, Stranger Things happens pretty good. Not as knock my socks off as I thought it was gonna be. Having read a handful of Kelly Link beforehand, but never actually like a full book. But just like a really solid collection of stories, just really good use of language. Thanks for not watching.